Get started. All right. So thanks. Appreciate everyone kind of joining this first pass kind of dry run to go through kind of what we've started to put together here, and then this session I'm really looking for feedback, especially from the PM team around how we are collecting this data, more specifically how we're putting this together so that we can one kind of create a good conversation with the product team around some of the things that we're finding out in the field. I think just to give some context here really quick, this has been a long time coming, trying to figure out a better method for getting feedback, right? I think right now our biggest pain point isn't necessarily that we have no feedback coming from the field. It's just that it's coming from a lot of different places. It's coming from different teams. The way that we're kind of representing the data that we found from customers and prospects requests is very different and kind of varying across the board. I think that my opinion is that one of the things that we are doing with our feedback right now is I think we're taking it a little bit too literal, in that a lot of times we'll get requests from prospects or customers to do something very specific. In my example that I had in that document, it was like, customer said, we need ServiceNow integration. It's like, okay, understand you need ServiceNow because you currently use ServiceNow, but let's kind of break that down into what specifically is the problems that you're trying to solve. Like, what's the flow look like? How are you, how are you achieving that today? And then the goal of this is that, through our CS team, where we have, both customer facing and technical kind of mindsets around how we approach this, we're able to distill that down from the CS side into more general kind of problem statements and themes of, what we're hearing out in their field, so that then the product team then can take that information and make, better decisions about what we actually implement into the product, rather than just, hey, we heard this one thing, let's go implement that thing. It's like, let's take those things and determine how we are inside, GitLab are going to, make that accessible to people who maybe in that example want to use ServiceNow, but also more generically, so that, we're really encapsulating the requests and there's more than one way to achieve that, so that we're not putting ourselves into, kind of technical debt around that. So that's kind of the quick intro there of what we're trying to do here. Approach wise, so the idea is that I really think that it's important for us to have some dedicated kind of resources that from both the product and easy with the product team, because we have product managers, right? But on the CS side, there's everyone's out there kind of working their own world, right? And so by being able to kind of consolidate that to a single person or a couple of people to distill that information down, it one gives the CS team someone to go to who has direct communication with the product managers, but two, it also allows us to have that information bubbled up in a way that's not coming from 50 different sources. So that's conceptually the idea there, is that we'll have an SA and a TAM kind of as the DRIs for each individual stage that has a product manager associated to it. Right now, it's not every single, it's every single stage, but not necessarily every single product group underneath that. I think the idea is that, and then that like, for example, manage can take that information and relay that to plan and all those kind of things there too. So, again, kind of coming to that diagram there, where I have kind of funneled it together. So we're kind of collecting information, bubbling it up to one place, and then we all know where we need to go to kind of get that information in a fashion where we have a good kind of back and forth relationship with the direct people involved. So that's kind of the conceptual idea there. Before we get kind of started into the tactical components of this, any thoughts or questions or concerns or approaches that we should be considering? I think about this particular group here as that dry run group where we're getting that feedback of like, hey, before we roll this out to all the teams, where it's about 80 people involved entirely for all of this to happen. So I want to make sure that we're rolling this out in a way that's, one, iterative, so that we're not kind of boiling the ocean in the first pass, but two, we're collecting the right information here as a starting place that will allow us to expand and to iterate on top of that going forward. So just kind of open it up to everyone to provide a little feedback there, and then we can kind of get started into how I'm thinking about this process working and seeing if there's any gaps or holes in that approach.
John Mason here. I'm sorry, was I cutting someone off?
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
First of all, I really appreciate your taking this on. I think it's fantastic to have more channels for customer feedback to come to product management, and to do that in a consistent way. That's really helpful. So thanks again for spearheading this.
Sure.
I would say that one of the very first things that came to mind for me as I was scanning through the document was that as a product manager, the raw material, especially contact information, links to specific customers, links to conversations with customers, or knowledge base articles or Chorus AI videos, are most valuable to me, even more valuable than the analysis. And I wouldn't want, everyone has limited time, and I would much rather see the person sending this information to me as a product manager to put the time into sending, links, forwarding an email or something like that, than trying to do a lot of analysis on, well, this user wanted this, this one user wanted this. It may be something like that. I'm interested in your opinions, but I also even just having access to the raw material is super helpful.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, especially on the chorus recordings. I think that from that template, I'll take a note to add that to the template, the project template for the issue, or the issue template to link to chorus recordings of where this had come from, right? So that at least we can give you some of that information to put there. That's a good suggestion. Thanks.
So I had a couple questions from the Tams side. Is the goal here, because we know that Tams are constantly reaching out to product managers, scheduling them on calls. Is that supposed to change with this initiative?
No, I think so. I think that's related, but not exactly what the goal of this is, right? I think we're still always going to have times where it's definitely makes sense to pull in product managers to conversations and kind of going through that approach. We did have one point Joshua Lambert put on the product on the product project inside GitLab.com, a template for requesting, hey, we need to bring someone into this. And so that was an attempt for that kind of side of it. It didn't really take off that way. I think I kind of think about the maybe phase 2 is more integrating some of that, how do we get, when and how is the best approach to getting product involved in these conversations at the right time. I see that being, something we'll roll into this, but here is more just, I think that a lot of the I guess I call it complaints from the product organization is that, one, they want more feedback. 2, where and how to get that feedback is not simple. And then, but on the other side of it, from the CS side of it, whether it be Tams, working with existing customers, or SAs on the prospects, we also have that problem of, it comes up inside a deal, and is this a consistent theme that we're hearing across multiple different customers, or is this a one-off situation? And I think a lot of times we're getting feedback about one-off situations that maybe are not, maybe very important to that one customer, but not really fitting in within, the priorities of, 15 other customers who have this other request. And so I think that the ability here to kind of bring that into a single place where we're bubbling that information up and delivering that to product, and the product can get that, I think the idea there is then, we can drill down into some of those things. Hey, maybe it makes sense for us to set up a call with this customer. Maybe it makes sense for us to invite this person to the cab. It could be all kinds of different, outcomes that come from that. But the problem with, the piecemeal, I have this request, or I have this one thing, is causing, people to be pulled in a lot of different directions. And it's hard for us to kind of, set priorities of what's most important. And I also think about there's been a couple of attempts from the sales organization to say, here are the top X number of things that we think are most important for us to close deals. And I look at those lists and I'm like, yeah, okay, those things did come up and they may have come up, but it's really like whoever was the loudest to talk about those things or whatever deal, got the attention of a larger audience. That's where that list came from though. And I don't think that's indicative of the best approach for us tackling these big kind of problems of either we don't have it or something needs to be resolved quickly. So, trying to get away from that, last minute putting together lists of things that we should be focusing on. I don't find those to be very helpful, and I don't think they're very accurate. So this is an attempt to get away from some of that.
So one of my initial thoughts, and I don't know the how on this, because it certainly wouldn't be fair to put all the onus on CS. One of the things that PMs do is we have the PM stand up. And so we talk about like, what did we learn this week? And that seems like maybe one method of ingesting this data. So for example, like I work with Yolanda pretty frequently on some customers. And so I'm somewhat familiar with the asks from her customers. But if I'm not working with a TAM regularly, it would be helpful to know, like in any particular week, what are the things that came up? Like regardless of importance, just seeing a list of, they asked about user roles and permissions. They asked about enforcing jobs and pipelines. They asked about, compliance checks and MRs. Because if we have just sort of a raw list of things, then I think the PMs can then ingest that and say, oh yeah, like this is me. Oh, I know that's actually Jackie Michel. And oh, this is Harris. Those two things are John Mason, and Melissa could probably handle these three, which I think is the intent of this whole effort.
Exactly.
But yeah, that getting that type of raw feed, because the course links are really important for context, but personally, I don't watch them unless I need to. I'm looking for like that easy to grok summary. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on how we can maybe aggregate that data, but that seems like a potentially great starting point.
That is definitely the space that I would say the biggest risk here is like, even just this, I know this is very last minute that I asked, Yolanda and Adrian to kind of put a few things together, and we haven't had a process for this. And so, it's like for, how, what do we need to do from the CS side to, basically trigger when we have feedback that should go to some product manager. I think that that's the key there is like, figuring out what that cadence looks like throughout the month before we kind of have that conversation of, maybe there's a Slack room in someone's, I don't know what it looks like there. Some way for us to better aggregate that. That's one thing I need to figure out how to solve better. And I'm definitely open to some suggestions or thoughts on how we can do that. But, to your other point there though, and that's exactly one of the hard parts for the CS organization in general is that, I have this one request from a customer. I have no idea where to go with that. Like I can start from somewhere, but then, there's a lot of that kind of ping pong where it's like, sometimes I'll ask one thing somewhere and then they'll point me somewhere else and I'll go to like 6 different groups before I finally get that right answer. And so like that becomes very frustrating to do on an individual basis over and over and over again across a 110 person team. And so, that's definitely that's why we want to have, these DRIs so that they know, hey, I can, I've spent a lot of time with these product managers. I know what stuff goes where. I can kind of, send this to them. They can then, take that to the right teams from there rather than us trying to hunt everything down individually each time. So, but yeah, the collection part is going to be the tricky part, right? So it's, how does the CS team, the DRIs of that, get that information throughout that month of what's top of mind of customers and top of mind of what we're presenting and what's coming up in conversations.
Yeah, that's definitely proved a challenge for me over the last 5-6 days or whatever. I posted a couple of requests and for people to feed information, and they're I guess it's they're already logging it. They're already adding it to specific issues. So it's how do we pick up that? Are we as the DRIs expected to pick up the information that say another CS member has already logged to an issue? Because I don't think that's
not going to work. Yeah, that model is not going to work.
But on the other hand, you don't want to create too much duplication. in terms of how we get that feedback. And it was just, we don't want those valuable nuggets to fall down a hole, but it's just how do we get them? I see it as a bit of a challenge on the CS side.
Yeah, and that's going to be the hardest part for sure. But I think once we can get a place where people are dumping some of that raw data of like, maybe there's a mechanism where we can say, I've done these presentations and there's these topics came up, and you kind of just dump that into a single place, and then then it's on the the team who's the DRIs to kind of look through that and say, okay, here's what we've been seeing in the last couple of weeks. Let's take some of these things and put them into some topics that then we can discuss and distill those down into, here's the customers involved, here's maybe some recordings, here's the general themes. Is this a blocker or is this not a blocker? I think that's an important piece there that oftentimes gets missed, is that, the urgency of some of these things. Everything to every customer is the most urgent thing, right? But I think about urgency in like a couple of ways to determine that based off of, if it's a hard blocker, meaning there is no workaround, and it's a requirement, that is an urgent thing. If there's a workaround and it's just not a great experience, then that's not as high of an issue, right? So there's some things that we can use to kind of determine some of those priorities there, but that's not getting translated very well right now. I've noticed that it's like, it's just whatever the most noise is means it's most important, and that's been clearly not the case. So
but is that something we should be documenting then, Brian, the priority levels that you've identified right now on that CS, the notes? I'm just, because I think that's very valid. If there is a workaround, then maybe it's not as high as a priority as it's something that's actually preventing work. So
yeah, exactly. So I'm going to add so I have that using labels section. I have severity labels that's already in there, S1 through S3. And, there's some definitions around what those are, but I think I'll add in some more kind of context into that of, what makes an S1, or sorry, a P1, it's not S1, but P1 priority.
Yeah.
If you look,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, just if you look at the definitions that we use for bugs and security, there's some, like some of those definitions do include, if a workaround exists. So, if this is a showstopper, then it's a P1. If it's a showstopper with a workaround, it's a P2, and so on and so on. So there are some definitions. You can look at those and get some inspiration for how you want to label yours. I would say that one mechanism that works really well between triage or support and PM is a weekly triage report that all PMs get. It is automated. It parses all the issues that are out there that the PMs haven't laid their eyes on and groups them into different groupings. So like as a general concept, sounds like something that if you guys apply certain labels as far as priority goes, as far as importance or customers or area, then those could be delivered in a report to the appropriate PM to take a look at and then potentially send further triage or do something with. But that, if you're looking for kind of that mechanism, there's a mechanism we have right now. We had the bot actually weekly pulls all of these things together and groups them and gives us even a heat map of which things are, like how are we looking on like how many P1s versus P2s versus P3s, and you can click into any one of those and find the P1s or the P2s and the P3s. I mean, it's fairly sophisticated. We can start really simple and then let it evolve into that mechanism. So I find it useful. We can probably ask other PMs to see if they find it useful or if they just hate when it happens. But yeah, I've just linked one in the chat here if you guys want to take a look or just open it to see what it looks like. But that may be a mechanism, because that's like one thing we're looking for is a mechanism. I do have some thoughts about some of the other things. Since I'm speaking, I don't want to interrupt all the time. I do feel like this would be great to collect, first of all, to collect feedback. So the collection is the value add here for the PMs, collecting things on a pile and maybe even grouping things together to sort of provide areas that all relate to each other but have different requests in it. The other value add for me is, and then I do agree with both I think John Mason and Matt both said that raw data is important. I don't think that it would be a value add for me if there was a large amount of synthesis, or if there was, or if the raw data was somehow lost. So I do feel like, and then also a lot of time spent for somebody to synthesize all this raw data and try to figure out what everybody's trying to tell us. Like, what is the message here? So I can't, we don't need that. Actually, we would prefer not to get that. And I think that may be a time sink for somebody to actually go through all of these and try to synthesize them all. So PMs are, for better or for worse, tasked with the synthesis. So I'd prefer to just be thrown raw data at, so that I can compare it to all my other raw data and take it into account. But the collection and the presentation and the grouping of that raw data would be really helpful to me. Filtering also probably wouldn't. So same way the synthesis does, and I think like filtering is may not be the right thing to do, but grouping, yes.
Mm-hmm. That's quite interesting, because I was sort of thinking you'd want the opposite to that. And so, if, for example, if you've already got existing issues for the top, as a particular, problem, and within that there's links to Salesforce for customers, et cetera, I was sort of thinking, do I need to duplicate all that again in the, the issue, or do I sort of summarize it up to, my view of it, thinking that you wouldn't want to see all those links again. But from what you're saying, it sounds if you prefer to see that raw data in there,
I would say
rather than a link off to the existing issue that's got the raw data in.
If you have an issue that is related to it, then adding to the issue is the right thing to do. But if we don't, and we have some kind of mechanism of turning all this raw input into issues that then get labeled, then that's probably good enough, because when I get the issue and I can relate it to the other issues. Like, I don't need somebody to then also maybe spend a lot of time trying to synthesize all those issues together. I'd be okay if I got this report and I'd be able to recognize trends or find issues that are related. So if they're found, fine, but I wouldn't want somebody to spend too much time trying to pretty it all up in pretty issues and finding all the related issues and connecting it. Just whatever works. What's going to work is really what can be automated and done easily. Like any complicated process will not take on.
Agreed. Yeah, that's definitely the part. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, so what I wanted to share is actually at my previous job, we had the same issue, and we landed on a process that's actually pretty similar to what's on the document. And we were a couple, 2-3 months into it. So I wanted to share some of the things that we found, as positives and negatives, right?
Awesome.
So positive is that for PMs, it did work and it got less noisy, right? Like, we had more streamlined feedback, right? It seemed to be more kind of like trends rather than one-offs, right? So in that way, it did help. And the negatives, right, was that I heard from some of the field team that they felt like they were sort of process bound, if that makes sense, right? Like, they felt like they lost some of that ability to just go to PM and have a call, right? So I think that's something to be mindful of, right? Just to have a good balance between, having a process to synthesize all of it, but also, having a way for everyone to be able to reach out to PM, right? Like, you don't want people to feel like, the DRI is the only person who has access to PM, and now I'm boxed in with this process, right? I think that's just something to be mindful of, right?
Absolutely.
Of just making sure we message it in a good way. Something that helped the field team kind of agree on what's important, because that's the next challenge, right? Now you're collecting everything, putting it all in one place, right? It's now, in theory, right, within the team that's collecting feedback, you have to sort of agree on what's the most important thing, right? Something that helped was just having mechanisms for voting, right? So what they did is they had a list of things, right? And then they would all take some time ahead of meeting to read through it and vote on the things that they felt were important. and then they didn't have to go through the whole list, right? They would only go through the ones that got the most votes, or the ones that they felt strongly were important but didn't for whatever reason, right? So it narrowed down the discussion points from like, 50 things to like 10, right? So then it's realistic to go through all of them and kind of as a group understand them, because if you go through the whole list, like, you're never gonna review it all.
Totally. Yeah. No, and that's exactly right. Is like, I think this concept isn't one to replace the the way people can communicate internally. I think we should be able, everyone can reach out to everyone, right? But I think we actually have some of the opposite problem going on right now, where it's that sometimes if it's not a urgent, I need to get back to the customer on this ASAP. They don't know where to go or how to get time and, scheduling and all that kind of stuff. And so it just goes to the wayside, right? And then that gets pushed away. And so this gives the people a mechanism to do that. But then also, I think too, it's really creating a better pathway and relationship between the two teams, because everyone can have their own individual relationships with every product manager, and that's all good and fine. But really, it's when you start to build some cadence around this and start to build some themes, that starts to be easier for everyone to kind of get involved in, whether it's customer conversations or product conversations on direction around that. I'm hoping this will kind of make that process a little bit easier.
Yeah, and the other two things in which it helped, one is like it helped us see themes that we didn't see before, because everyone was operating independently, right? So that was actually pretty interesting, that some people were like, oh wow, your customer needs that too, that like I didn't know, right? And the other way in which it helped is like it did help start to build some trust in that, like, okay, you have this list, of things that you need, and we will listen, we will work through that list, and it's very visible, right, that list is getting shorter, right? Versus, like you said, if it's everywhere, it's hard to see kind of like, how does that fit into the PM process? Like, are they taking from the list?
Exactly.
So it helped in those ways. But I think just making sure there's still room for people to have the one-off conversations and to kind of feel like they can still work with the people the way they used to.
Yep.
I don't think you need to worry about that.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So let's go ahead.
One more thing. So is it natural for you, for customer success, to align to stages? I was wondering about sort of why the mapping to stage versus some other level. Is it just because we just need something smaller and we have this many people, therefore everybody gets this? Because I would imagine a lot of clients come with requests that cut across stages, or is it not the case? Do they typically like ask for a lot of depth in a stage?
They're definitely across stages, right? And so, I mean, that's a big problem we have in general, is, something that fits into a request that fits into multiple stages. How do you go about getting that feedback into place? And so, I'm thinking that this is going to help with that, because what that does is it allows us to, if we bring this up into one of the stages conversations, and as we talk through that, we start to realize it spans multiple stages, then we have the ability to kind of expand that out, and we know when that kind of triggers the conversation of, okay, this is an issue that maybe primarily is a manage issue, but also is a create issue, and also is something else. Then that gives I think that mechanism right there is really important, because right now what I see happening is that if it doesn't directly fit into one of the stages and it's just an issue that's out there, it doesn't usually get picked up, right? It doesn't become, unless it's something that comes up from a larger conversation, it doesn't get kind of moved into it. So if we bring this up into, here's a theme for hearing of this, it maps into this stage as a starting place, but that will trigger the PMs to kind of branch out to the other teams and see how we can achieve this across multiple stages. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we would better triage issues that are multi-stage. And I mean, has there been an attempt at that? I assume there's been some attempts at that before, right? With labels and, some of these reports you're talking about.
Categories, so you can tag multiple categories, while only one stage per issue can be labeled. You can label multiple
Sure.
categories. So that may be a way for us to do. And then there is a mapping of each category has only one PM. And if we did this automated report, that particular issue could land on two managers or two product managers' reports.
Yeah.
Or views, or however we choose to consume this.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense.
Cool.
So tactically here, so we have this project set up, and I'll just open up my share. Why is this not sharing? It's weird. All right, there we go. So yeah, technically, I think so. So one of the, just to give you some context here, I wanted this to be a separate, other part that we have to struggle with is that when we give feedback on GitLab as a project itself on GitLab.org, you know, we have to be very cautious about, you know, chorus recordings, naming customers. You know, we do the Salesforce link thing, but that's, you know, that's only one piece of it. Having this be part of GitLab.com means that we have a little bit more freedom to kind of express specific customer requests and have recording calls and all that kind of stuff in a place that's, you know, more protected, but still can link to our normal project, our normal GitLab project where the issues may originated. So we still have that linking mechanism, but this gives us a place to kind of focus on that. And then I think from a board standpoint too, you know, each month, you know, maybe we have I don't know if it's, we have different boards or maybe just kind of the same board over and over again, and you just kind of, you know, triage things out eventually. But I think there's a couple of benefits of this approach. One is that, you know, we're bubbling up the most important things. Like I looked at that list, you know, Harris, that you posted, and it's like hundreds of issues, right? Like that's pretty unmaintainable, and it's hard to know what's important, what's not. You know, distilling it down to smaller groups, then we have that kind of high level visibility even across the multiple stages as we're looking at this of, okay, I can kind of see what things are going on here. And then the idea is that, you know, we put these information into this, and then the monthly conversation that we have kind of going through I'm hoping we're having, you know, maybe 10 or 15 issues in here as kind of a max for each month's conversation, you know, so that we can spend 5 to 10 minutes on each one of those. So it's really about just the most important things too. So it's really bubbling up the top priorities into that space. And then from like a perspective of like, you know, how do we go through this and what is the right information in here? You know, we do have the project template that I've created. So for example, this one I put in this morning, you know, keeping it relatively simple from a template standpoint at this point, but I think pulls it out. Again, I'm going to add in, to your point, Harris, some recording, a section for recording so that people can paste those in as well. But you know, again, getting away from the idea of point solutions and just, you know, summarizing this is a specific thing, right? But there's actually kind of a bigger trend here of, you know, how does my customer have an easier and better method for understanding the relationship between a specific user, their permissions, and the projects that they're part of when they're in an organization of thousands and thousands of users and projects, right? There are ways to do that today, but the problem is that, you know, typically this comes up when there's an emergency situation where they need to figure out who had access to what or something like that, and that process is super time consuming, and you know, large enterprise customers can't do that. So, you know, if I look at this, you know, I think about what's our problem with this. It's like, well, the problem is all the data is there. You can find all of this. The way you get it is very complicated. Either you go into the UI and click into every single project, and, you know, you can filter by who's been explicitly added or not, but you still have to go through all of that and find those. When you have thousands of users, that's hard to do. You know, so this is an example of one that I think makes sense. And these, you know, you can see the big customers, all compliance-oriented customers, Goldman Sachs, American Family Insurance, UBS, a bank in Europe. You know, they all have this kind of same concern of like, how do I see this information? And so, you know, I've summarized that. I put the problem of what that really is, you know, labeled it P3 because there are workarounds. You can do this today. It's just not an ideal state for someone who is administrative to find that information. And then maybe like a desired solution. This is an area where I think that, you know, based on conversations we have with customers of like how they're solving this today or what their desired state is, you know, distilling that down into maybe some ideas. You know, one suggestion I hear here is ability to like open up some sort of entity relationship diagram where I can go into a place and say, here's my user, now show me all the groups that they're a part of. And then I can click into the groups and see the projects and see their entitlements and each individual one of those. So it makes it easier for me to navigate a individual user's contribution and access to different areas, right? That's kind of the layout that I have here set up from just a purely is this the right template information that we're pulling out of this and for the team from the product side of it? Like, do you feel like this is an approach that will get the right kind of conversation started where we can provide valuable feedback in real time? And two, does this kind of capture more than we would be able to capture inside of an issue on GitLab.com, but still allow us to have a internal discussion about how we can approach these things?
So I'll comment, since that seems to touch my group. So I think this information is good. I think this is probably the necessary starting point. And then my ask would then be, I'd love to hop on a call with at least one of these customers to unpack that. Because we already know that there's a need for exporting like a user access report. So show me a list of all users and what group and project memberships they have. My understanding from the latter half of this ask is, we want to be able to drill down on a specific user and see like what's their commit history, MR history, project memberships, roles, etc. And that's a much more complicated ask. It's not unachievable, but I would like to understand why they need that, because to me, that's speaking to a very risk-averse organization, and it may not make sense for us to build that seemingly very nuanced feature set versus providing maybe a suite of features that they themselves can combine to get that information. Because like we have 3 different audit reports we want to work towards, right? A chain of custody report, the user access report, and audit events. And maybe using those 3 things, they can then consolidate in what they probably already have as a data warehouse and like map those relationships. But for us to do the heavy lifting on what's probably a very nuanced process for them might not make sense, which is why I need to talk to them about that.
Absolutely. So that's, first of all, thanks for that, because I think this is exactly why I think these discussions are important, right? Is that I can lay out the information here and, you can kind of distill that down, but now I have more context into this. I can provide, some details. But the other piece I pull out of this is maybe we need to have another trigger point inside these issues of, yes, these are the desired by customers and prospects, but are any of these customers or prospects willing to talk to somebody from product? And so we can note that in there as well. So then that gives us an opportunity for you to say, hey, I see that Goldman Sachs is willing to talk about that. Who owns that account and who can I talk to about getting that set up, right? So that's the other side of it there, is that, I know it's not always easy for someone from product to get involved in those when they're looking at an issue of like, oh, I need to talk to this customer, now I have to go track down the right person, get this meeting set up, all that kind of stuff. Now we can talk about this and also give you some more context into it beforehand. And if we need to set up a customer, we can. So thanks for that. I think, in this particular instance, I think you're right. I think this is definitely a risk-adverse organizations, very, very large organizations who have lots and lots and lots of data. I think a solution that where we at least provide them with a mechanism. I think where we sometimes write off the importance of having at least a partially baked solution. Doesn't need to be a fully, we don't even necessarily have like an entity diagram map built directly into it, right? But we might need to have a mechanism that says, if you want to pull this data out, here's our approach to doing that. It's not just here's the API endpoints. It's maybe what you do is say like maybe we need a document, or maybe we need a blog post or something. Maybe that's the outcome of this, that just says simply, hey, if you want to pull this data out into one place so you can do these types of compliance checks, maybe a best recommendation is that you set up a separate project at the top level of your group, and you set scheduled pipelines that output data into another system with JSON, and then you can review it that way. Like giving them more of the meat of how they would go about doing something like that in a way that we will kind of support and maintain, and also, add more features into it that they can then consume, so that they're not going down a path where they're maintaining technical debt, right? So maybe, so that's kind of the conversation that I like to get out of. It's like, this is maybe not something we add in, but maybe there's a need for us to have better documentation or a sample project of someone doing this or something like that, so that the CS team can say, oh, you have that problem. We've got this sample project in this blog post on how you can achieve that done, right? And I think that's really what I want to get out of some of these pieces here, rather than, yeah, we already have that feature. They can go do that if they want to go build it, right? Like what's the next step there to make it easier for customer success to go back to a customer with a better answer than just go use the API and pull in 10 different endpoints and figure it out, right?
Brian, so then would it be helpful then to add use cases in this issue for each customer,
Absolutely.
for each of those three? And then secondly, I don't know, I think we're a little bit over time, but I wanted to kind of understand what the next steps are. Is the plan to us for our managed group to meet every month? And then between now and then, it's on, for example, me as a TAM, my job to gather all the TAMs and all the feedback and make a list of like 15 top requests for us to review when we meet again?
I think that's the trickiest part that I don't have a perfect answer for right now, is like, yeah, how do you go about collecting that rather than you going and prodding every single person to go give you information, which will never work and will die on the vine if we try to go that route. Maybe it's we have to figure, but that ultimately, yes, that's what I'm trying to get at, is that once a month we meet and have this conversation of the top 10 or 15 things that are most important, and most top of mind of customers today. So we're pulling that out as a curated list. How we get that information, that's I think something that we'll have to brainstorm on a better way of getting there. Maybe it's you have a list of things that come up, or maybe product can provide us like that that output, and then we distill down 10 different topics and say, hey, does anyone have customers or prospects that are interested, or is this a high priority for them? And then they can weigh into that and then take that information back. Something like that, where we're providing more context rather than just a free for all, tell us what you need. It's here are some things we're thinking about. Sorry.
Can I share my screen real quick? I just want to show kind of how TAMs are tracking issues that customers are following.
Mm-hmm.
So from the TAM side, this is VMware. Is it sharing my VMware screen? Okay, cool. All right, I didn't see the little green line around it. Okay, so we have a issue of issues. Okay, great. Now I'm not gonna find it. Hold on one sec. Sorry, I should have pulled that up first. Okay, so these are everything that VMware has told us that they care about. We split them up into stages. So here we have everything that is manager related that VMware cares about that they've told us, and also marked as priority high or low. Would it be helpful? I think it would be a lot easier for TAMs to pull their list, because most TAMs have something like this.
Totally.
And then maybe tag, add another label that's like CS feedback for manage, or something that we can maybe create another bot for, and then pull all TAMs, and then that way I know which TAMs to be hitting up for feedback. Or I could even go into each TAM's list and look at what their use case is.
Or yeah, exactly. Or maybe what we do is just as a starting place, the items that are labeled high or maybe even medium high, that's the point where you would go in and say, okay, I'm looking through the high and medium for this customer. I'm going to take some of these and distill those down into an issue that I'm going to talk to the product about and have more details around.
Yeah.
Because I think what the good point about, I like that. First of all, I think that's great that's how we're organizing that. But second, a lot of times if you were to pull out just the high priorities of all TAMs into one list, and then we put that out there and said, does this resonate with any of your customers? Do they have these use cases? And let them kind of fill in some details that gives more information there. Then you can take that back into the issue that are related to manage. I think that would be a good starting approach that doesn't require a ton of effort on your side.
Yeah, and it's really cool to see that. As a product manager, sometimes I even care about the lows, not because of the urgency of them, but because I happen to be working on something related to that anyway. And there may be some additional context from that particular customer that I could go back and replay a design in front of and get some feedback on but it may not be a high priority item for them.
So would it be helpful then to pull, if we did create our own bot, like the one that Harris shared with all the labels being pulled out, if we did something like that for something that's labeled as managed stage, and that maybe I could ask all the TAMs to tag them as CS feedback for manage?
Yeah, and I think the cool thing about this too is I like that, because I think maybe a separate label does make sense, because then what it does is allows the TAM to trigger an issue to get reviewed more in detail without them actually having to go and track people down and doing that. So if they were just to go into that list and say, these are things that I would like discussed in this conversation with the product team, they can label those as such, and then we take that information and bring that to the teams. I think that would be a really easy way for them to not have to go and track things down and figure out what the state is and how we can approach that, and just say, I just add this label in, I know the DRI is going to go and take this and ask me if I have any input or whatever, and go and talk about that. And so it's getting pushed forward. It's like it gives them a mechanism for that to make sure that happens. So I like that idea. Maybe I'm thinking so I feel like that's the biggest piece that needs to be solved still, is like, how do we make this easy enough that it's not going to be a tremendous amount of work on the DRIs, but also we're getting the right information in place. Maybe what I'll do is schedule some time this week for the CS side of the organization. Like, I'll pull together some like a list of the DRIs of like brainstorm like what we can do for that as kind of a parallel next step to kind of getting this rolling. So that we can see what the process there is. So I'll do that on our side, because I think that's the biggest gap I see right now, is like, how do we make sure we're getting the right information bubbled up to the DRIs, right? Without them, pulling teeth. That's not going to work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Brian, I did send you a merge request for the template, the issue template.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. But I love that idea, Yolanda, of having like when we list out the customers, what their exact use case is for that too, so that we have that in context. So yeah, good suggestion there.
Because then I think it would be helpful once we meet with managed group, we say, Matt, you could ask us the questions, or like what you just said, you needed to know specifically for that use case. We could take that on and take it back to the TAM, so that you don't have to be on every call asking the same questions over and over. We could do that. Even create like a running list of, if this is important to you, answer these questions for us, so we can deliver those back.
Exactly.
Yeah,
if it helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great starting point, right? Like I think it's maybe a much more efficient way to shortcut a lot of that data up front, because if we can basically if we can get them to convey to you all the story, right? Like, oh, well, I need to be able to pull this data because my company's InfoSec policy and compliance team want me to be able to provide this every month for, SOX or SOC 2, or even just like an internal audit compliance program. That in and of itself is really helpful. And then when that comes back to me, I can then say, okay, yeah, I'd like to either ask these follow-ups and continue that kind of liaison relationship, or jump on a call with the customer directly and say, okay, totally understand this, but now let's talk about the actual implementation. Do you really need this? And kind of have that conversation, to my point earlier. So I'm open to iterate and experiment with that. I don't mind that.
Cool. I think that's a great idea. And then I think the last thing that I ask from the product management side is that, not the first one we do, but the second one going into these is that, the product managers come back to the CS team and say, since we spoke last, here's what we've been doing on these things, or here's how we prioritize these, so that we can take that back to the CS team and say, we're working towards this. Now is a good time for us to get a customer involved, or now is a good time for us to, relay that information to the customer or prospect or whoever it may be. Because I think that's the other piece that the CS team tends to struggle with, is like, yeah, I see milestones on here, but did that really, am I going to go ask every product manager that's really going to happen in this milestone? What does it really look like, right? And so if we can get that information, and that the CS DRI can be that point for someone at customer success, say, hey, I had this issue, I see it's been talked about, what's the status? You already know that, so we don't have to.
Yeah, I think there's two ways we can approach that, maybe simultaneously. One is the release post, not as a cop-out, but like that's the surefire way to know that something made it into a particular release. But two, PMs, one of the things that we've alluded to earlier is that it's difficult for PMs to do validation work of things that we care about versus what the customers care about. So for example, what I've had to do is if a customer says, hey, I want to get on a call to talk about X, Y, or Z, I'm like, yeah, no problem. And then I'll talk to the TAM. Can we make sure that we set aside even just like 5 minutes for me to do some validation on a solution we're trying to build? And that solution might be something totally unrelated to what the customer is interested in, but I still need that feedback for them on that totally to them unrelated thing. For example, compliance dashboard. Customers have said, yeah, that's great, we like it, but then we can't get them on the phone to validate it. So I've had to sneak in these like 5-minute segments. And that might be something we can incorporate in a way that's like, hey, here's an update on what we've done since then. Also, can we set aside some time for this problem or solution validation? So that's another pain point that'd be great to solve from the PM perspective. But I think as far as the updating, yeah, like we all maintain planning issues, which is one source of truth. The release post is another. The feature blocks themselves, the merge request for the feature blocks is another indicator. So I think there's a lot of ways we can try to consolidate that information in some way.
Yeah, and I think the more important piece is not did this get into this release, but if it was kicked out to the next release, does that mean that it's going to happen in the next release? Or are we just kind of pushing this out to indefinitely? Because I think that's where we get into trouble with customers. Is like, oh, we didn't get in this one because of X, Y, and Z, but next month you're good to go. That's not always the case. That is not always the case. And then we start to lose trust, right? So I think this helps kind of solve some of that, and where we have some real-time conversation of like, hey, this didn't happen. Like, where are we at? And then the other side of that too is that, take for example, HashiCorp Vault integration, right? We rolled out that the managed, we've done 2 iterations of that. The first one was the managed, Vault inside Kubernetes cluster, right? So we rolled that out, and that was one step. But the reality is, like, if I go through the list of the high priority customers who asked for that use case doesn't get solved in that, right? And I think that's a good place for us to provide some feedback around that. Is that, yes, we have that now, and yes, that may be valuable, but it's not valuable for this particular user who's asking for this because it's a different use case. So there's some more context there we can get into.
Yeah. That is admittedly a problem for the product org. I know that on the product side, we have a directive from leadership to do iteration training and make sure that we are shipping small iterations so that we're not encountering that, or at least not as bad, right? Because if a customer wants X solution, well, that's fine, but we need to be able to like schedule the smaller iterations that get us there so that we're meeting those smaller deadlines, and that builds trust. And then we finally result in X solution over time, versus what you've alluded or referenced, which is absolutely the case. I can tell you that for the compliance group, and this is going to vary from group to group because it varies from PM to EM. So like in our 13.1 planning issue, we have the stuff that we're trying to tackle for the 13.1 milestone. And then we also have what we're calling the on deck label. And so that's where we take these like discovery or bigger kind of ambiguous concepts, and we say, during the 13.1 milestone, while we're all working, we need to set aside time to like break these other issues down so that we can start scheduling them. And the other issue is that PMs, at least according to the handbook, shouldn't be scheduling issues until they've had the discussions with their EMs and engineers to break the issues down. So if something continues to slip, in most cases, I think that's because the PM has set the milestone as we'd like to get it into this milestone, but then that cascades, right? Versus I've had my discussions with my EM, I've had my discussions with engineers and product design. We have agreed that this MVC is totally feasible and broken down enough that we can, with 90th percentile degree of confidence, ship this in this milestone.
Yeah.
And in that case, that latter case, if it doesn't ship, then it's an even higher confidence rating. We'll get into the next one because the development is going to roll through, because devs don't just stop working on things, right? So it is something that the product org is aware of and is working on. Maybe there's some pilot we can run together, at least the compliance group, where maybe we can collect data on how often we're meeting the milestones we say we're going to meet, and then use that to compare against traditional groups. Just as a means of showing like, hey, this is why it's so important, and this is why it's important for customers and the CS teams. Mm-hmm. But anyways, just a little context for you.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thanks. Okay, cool. Well, how about this as the next step? I think we have identified some gaps here. I think we've got some ideas around the template. I think we've got a pretty decent starting point. Yolanda and Adrian, I'll get some time scheduled to figure out like what is the best mechanism from both TAMs and SAs to bubble that information up to a place where we feel like, or you guys feel like, would be the task won't be so daunting that you'll not have enough time to get things done with your normal day-to-day job, but enough that you're getting involved in a lot more deeper discussions there. So I'll get that scheduled to figure out, but in the meantime, I think we'll kind of proceed with rolling this out to the teams, and we'll figure that out kind of in an async fashion there. That sound like
Sounds
a good
good.
plan?
Thank you, Brian.
Sounds a
Yep.
plan.
Cool. All right.
All
Well,
right.
thanks for all your help and getting this all set up. I appreciate it, and
Thank you.
I'll be in touch soon. Thanks.
Also, the issues that I added were just sample issues, nothing that I got feedback from. So I just threw those in there to show something.
Sure. Yeah.
So they shouldn't stick. Okay. Okay. Just
Yeah.
wanna make
Yeah. We
sure.
can close this out. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks.
Cheers.